And thank you to Zoom, because in addition to my friends here, we can think about our friends who are out there in Zoom land. Tuscaloosa, Huntsville,
Yes.
and last but not least, Montgomery. And I mention all of that because we're thinking about universities. And that becomes a very important area, as many of us are thinking not merely about our own Auburn, but other institutions as well. And of course, regardless of our area of interest in the Middle Ages, because I know some of you, looking at one right now, who's waiting for me to talk about Crusades next week. But he will have to, as we say commonly, suck it up today because I'm doing intellectual history, and some people appreciate that and understand that, yes, universities are a contribution of the Middle Ages, believe it or not. You go back to the Greeks, you go to the Romans, or go to other cultures, and you do not find these kinds of institutions, although some have tried to argue it. My feeling is that this is distinctly medieval. But of course, there are other contributions, all of which I cannot cover, but will attempt to note some. The universities of Western Europe, of course, will always fight to say, but we were the first, we were the first. So I'll let them do that, and I'll stay out of it and just say they're all mighty nice and really appreciate them, because you can really get into trouble. As a matter of fact, Alabama friends, during the 1980s, I would accompany students from Alabama and Auburn every summer to trips to Oxford University for the purpose of studying and sightseeing, because we at Auburn didn't have such programs. Things change over time, don't they? But at that time, the Alabama at Oxford program was all that we had. And of course, it's quite beautiful, but we understand that's not medieval. That's all about, let's imagine medieval. But this began to appear in the 19th century. Bologna is another very interesting place as far as medieval universities are concerned. And Bologna became the great legal center which is associated actually today. And again, these folks will fight over we were first, because you never say, well, we were second. I mean, nobody ever wants to do that. I've never heard anybody be a happy second. I mean, it's gracious. I know, but we want to be number one, because Cambridge will always, according to the Oxford folks, they would come out of Cambridge would come out of Oxford because some would get unhappy and move to Cambridge. Well, anyway, it's a very beautiful place near London. And again, it's the way we would like to imagine medieval, but you understand this is certainly not what it was like. And of course, finally, the Sorbonne in Paris. All of these are great places, and I could mention others too. Not, as they used to say rather insultingly in UK, the red brick universities, as if to be as offensive as possible. And you don't we try to be nice to other schools. So let's just, the spirit of ecumenical higher learning, let's just say they're all mighty nice. But the idea is, of course, where does all of this come from? And of course, they come from the church. And you can still see those beautiful chapels. I'm not sure exactly what they're used for now, but folks went to those services for a long time during many, many centuries. Because, of course, education, such as it was, came out of the Christian religion, specifically monastic schools. And to me, that's got to be the original source for learning, because the church needed literate clergy. So it's more or less, nobody else exactly, quote unquote, needs learning. It's not like learning is just some sort of, like, I don't think I'll plow today. I'd rather go take classes. Or it's not like you have a choice or options. But if you're going into the church, so to speak, pursue the religious vocation, you're clearly, if you're going to be a full-fledged priest or even lower rank, you're going to have some kind of learning. This doesn't mean every monk becomes a scholar. We all know that watching people pass through graduation. It doesn't mean everyone's, oh, please let me answer that. No, we understand that some get through. They finish and we're finished. I mean, it's like, but we're glad for them. They're out there, can get in the alumni association, and we understand that. That's nice. We need the money. But all of this is to say that monastic schools were based, what else? On the church's writings, scripture, St. Augustine, and other writing. And limitedly on the Roman writings, that is Latin. No Greek, just Latin. The Latin writings that were not Christian had to be, quote unquote, supervised, because you think they have a copy of the Book of Love? I don't think so. Monks don't need to read Ovid or anything like that, because that would cause impurity. And so basically, if there is some work like Cicero, we all love Cicero. For those of you who had Latin, you probably developed an insatiable love of Cicero. Or maybe some Virgil turns you on. I don't blame you for that either. All of this is to say that these works could be sought in a Christian way. If you've ever noticed Virgil spelled Vergil or Virgil, you think that's just an accident? I don't think so. Virgin, get it? Virgin. See, you got to believe, man. There are all kinds of interesting connections. And Virgil wrote about a new day was coming, and of course, he was talking about Caesar Augustus, but the Christians said he was talking about Christ. All of that is to say, we can use classical works up to a point if they're used the right way. Okay, but if you want to go all pagan, you need to be in agriculture. Okay, that's where you need to be. So those are monastic schools, because frankly, the early and medieval period was largely rural, wasn't it? So there wasn't a lot of urban life. The larger schools came about with the development of Western cities, starting, what would you say, Bologna and other places like that, Rome. These cathedral cities, which of course mean the cities where there are bishops, that's why we have a cathedral, not merely a large church. I always like to explain that to make sure that no one makes that error. The idea of the cathedral school doesn't mean that it's necessarily different, but of necessity it will become very different simply because of its location. It has, for the same purpose, the training of clergy, because the idea of lay people going to school, I think, is really a very strange idea because there's no point. If you are of that sort, then why aren't you in the church? You know, it's like there's nothing for you out there. If you are of the aristocracy, nobility, you would still have some kind of formal education of that sort. But as for the rest, what's the point? All of this then is going to be based on learning, but largely, in fact, almost entirely in Latin, or if not, through a series of translations. And that not very much during that earlier period. I might add just parenthetically that most of you will remember our dear friends, the Ostrogoths, the people who lived in Italy, unfortunately heretics, but they were nice heretics, and they tried to get along with the Catholics. There was at that time some scholars at the Ostrogothic court who still were familiar with Greek and classical Greek and all that. Unfortunately, one of them, you may know the name Boethius, was actually executed by the Ostrogothic king, not for knowing Greek, but just he was supposedly involved in court intrigue and little paranoia and nomads. And so he was a goner. Yeah. But he may have known some Greek, and he was busy translating Greek to Latin, which, yeah, would have been pretty great. But as far as we know, there wasn't a lot of that available. And so it's not like, and we don't like those folks in Constantinople anyway, right? So it's not like, can we come over and study with you all or hang out? And because we would love to, we appreciate you so much. No, we don't. We hate you because you're all going to hell. So all of that is to be understood. It's a Latin world, and we are happy about it. Now, see our queen up there? I find it very ironic that we have female figures, considering females were not getting to participate in any of this. If you were female and you wanted education, of course, you had to go to the convent and get it that way. But what would you do with it? Well, I guess become a teacher. Because you could be a priest, you couldn't have any position. So it was like just learning for the sake of learning, which is fun, but it's not going to be what you call, quote unquote, useful, except teach other sisters, I guess. So here we have the queen, and look above her name, reason. Ooh, reason. You think, oh my gosh, we love this. And look at all this, it's twirling around us. And you say, what are they? Well, I can promise you there's nothing vocational. They're not going to study any kinds of, what would you call it? Well, what's this got to do with my major? Oh, God, how many times have I heard that? No, this is not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to tell you my problems, but I've worked through that over the years. But all of these are the various areas of learning, and we'll talk about that shortly. I just thought it was interesting that this queen, who is going to be theology, but you'll notice that all of these others are surrounding and depicting what she'll do. The 7 liberal arts and all that we think of. I know, can you see that? Some of them kind of hard to rhetoric, grammar, arithmetic, and music, think Pythagoras, and all of that. And we'll look at that. Thought this was interesting because this will give you the 7 and grammar, rhetoric, or speech, and logic. And of course, we got to have a little philosophy. I mean, how could we do without it? Grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic, the trivium will involve a variety of fields. And of course, I know you're looking and you're going like, but what of history? We're everywhere. We are pervasive. We don't need a separate area. Everybody depends on history. So it's not like, oh, we don't need history. No, we may not have Herodotus and Thucydides because we haven't got them translated. But there's Livy, there are a variety of Roman historians, and we can read that because we're all about Latin. The quadrivium, and this is our scientific area. Music and mathematics go together, don't they? And so we have music, astronomy, and who could forget that from the ancient world, right? From Egypt and Babylonia and all the rest. Plus arithmetic and, of course, geometry. Who can get over the love of that? Ooh, parallelograms. Oh, bisecting. I won't even get into it. I get emotional. Yeah. Thinking about the joys that brought. But anyway, joking here. All of this, again, is illustrated here with the queen. And who is that queen? Well, of course, theology. Because you got to do all this, or as we like to call it at Auburn, the core curriculum. You say, I don't want to do that. I've got a job coming up and I don't need all that. Well, I'm sorry. You're going to take it. You better just enjoy it and study. That was my dream, but I've gotten past it. Anyway, some of the works that we would call like available to them included Ptolemy's Almagest, which was fascinating when you think that they had it in a Latin translation, because that went all the way back to very early times. Now, Almagest is obviously an Arabic term, so think about all the translations it went through. before it got to the Latin. As far as the idea of the geocentric theory here, it meant that dreams of Isaac Newton and all the rest are long apart. But this idea of geocentrism and, of course, Euclid's geometry, which I heard one scholar say, would in effect be so dominant in mathematics. It was not until maybe the 20th century that they stopped giving Euclidean numbers to call out geometric. And if you went to a mathematics convention and people could just call out the numbers, oh yeah, that sort of thing, and you get so left out. But they actually had the idea that Euclid was the last word. It wasn't like everybody's going to say, well, that was a long time ago, so we can kind of use it, but basically it's irrelevant because, man, this is the 12th century. We got to move on. No, this is the big deal. Ptolemy, Euclid, people like that. These are our texts that mean the world to us, literally. They are the source of knowledge. And you say, well, I'm anti-Euclid. I'm thinking, then you probably don't belong here. Expulsion, suspension, you need to get out. Yeah, because this is the way the teaching, and again, Latin through, could you imagine all the translations? Sometimes Hebrew was involved too. Yeah, I mean, they would come from Spain, and all of these various people would have them. And then finally, could you imagine? They would have the Latin version, and then it would spread through these various schools. From that, of course, after you took the trivium and the quadrivium, then you're ready for what I'd say is the career path. And you're not going to do an MBA or something. You're going to essentially study law or theology or all kinds of fields that we would consider to be perhaps useful. I wouldn't necessarily think we would think of theology as being useful, but certainly law, because by this point, governments, beginning with the church's government, are beginning to use written law and law courts, and those who are able, and that means well-to-do, are utilizing lawyers to sue people for this, that, and the other. Starting then with church courts and then secular monarchs moving on. Now, medicine, not experiments. No, we're not doing any body cutting up, but we're doing lots with Hippocrates and the study of his theories, but it is largely what we would call theoretical, how it should be. And then if we come across an issue that's not covered, we understand that it's a bad sample. So out it goes. Because, again, we are pretty much lined up with the models that are sort of almost sanctified, whether they be scientific or literary and certainly theological. That's why we call theology the queen of sciences, which sounds kind of odd, doesn't it? But in fact, it was. I mean, this is, if you manage to come out with a doctoral degree in theology, they would really work you over. And you'd say, well, what could you do? Well, I guess you could teach it, or you could be a theologian. And I don't, but again, does that mean you're going to get a bigger house or a bigger car? I know, but I think it would be quite an accomplishment. I mean, your parents would be mighty proud, I guess. The theology, because that was not easy, you can imagine. And lots of what we particularly love, orals, oral exams, makes me shudder even now to think about. Oh God, because there were some really mean people that I encountered, and they were going, "Oh, we're so glad to have you. We hope you get to join us." You know, that kind of, no, no, it was ugly. So now look at those students. I have seen this many a time. Say, I'm resting my eyes. Yeah, I bet you were. You are guilty of lethargy. Yeah, I know. You see him, Jim?
Yeah.
See him up there? They are resting. Say, well, I've taken some medicine that's making me. I'm thinking, oh, you almost missed all of World War One. You know, I mean, through, and I think the goddess of sleep, you know, has conquered you. I said now, but anyway, I think it's kind of interesting. These students are there, and you notice the rest of them are standing in the back. That means they can't afford the book. So they basically stand in the back to read the book because literally they're having a lecture. And these lectures, well, let's just say this. I don't know how they dealt with issues of the body, but they went on for hours and hours. And I don't think they had breaks. And the teacher in a lecture read to them in Latin, mind you. And he would read from law codes. You'd say, oh, that's stimulating. I know, it's exciting, isn't it? It could come from Justinian or decrees from earlier popes, Gregory's greatest hits. I mean, all kinds of Gregory first. I mean, yeah, you knew that. Yeah. And it's that idea, and you say, well, why would he do that? Well, then he could give his opinions of these law codes. And you say, so that would cause these people to suffer from doses of sleep needs. Yes. I cannot imagine. And you know how folks complain now, 50 minutes, and they still complain. But back then, you had to be hardy. Yeah, to be able to survive that. No caffeine either, because many of us would want to hit. Yeah, like we have here. Yeah. Oh, you're knocking it back right now. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jeff. That makes me, oh, yeah, I know, I know. So universities come from that word actually referring to groups, students groups, faculty groups. I think that's kind of interesting because most people don't know that. They think of a university as being like an association of colleges, and that's what, of course, it came to be. But the term university originally referred to the teachers and students and groups that would be organized and more or less established as a group, a self-identifying group. This meant these universities could then negotiate, because we understand that these universities founded outside cathedrals, these groups where scholars would come and students would come, and you know, the poor teacher see the students say, you want to learn a little legal history? you better come up to my class. I've got a syllabus for you. You're really going to like it. It's like you have to attract them. Now we can make them take it. Yeah, you're going to take it. It's like amazing that original group. Of course, you figure most of these students are there because they want to be. Why else would you be there? I guess it's better than farming. I don't know. But if you were smart and maybe your parish back home thought you were really special, maybe send you there. So all of this is to say these people organized and they could tell the teacher, we have certain requirements if you want to be our teacher. And then the teacher could lay down his particular requirements. So that is the idea. I mean, it's fascinating to me that these people had their negotiations, shall we say. I don't know about any walkouts or anything of that sort, but I do know that with teachers, and I referred to it politely as faculty leaves, but some of these teachers might have been corrupt, nay, dishonest. And actually, they were trying to get the tuition and then say, my health is failing, and so I won't be here for the rest of the term. And those people guilty of mendacity and corruption had taken all that money and they never came back. Mm-hmm. I know. And they give us all a bad name, right? I mean, what if I didn't show up? How would you feel? Cheated, chipped, and you would condemn me. But that apparently they were very careful about faculty leaves, how much time they could have off, and what they expected to cover in the course. It's fascinating to read this. A scholar, he was very big in the early 20th century. He uncovered a lot of this, and we find it fascinating to think about how these groups tried to set up standards, because if you pay your money and that's set on the syllabus, we have this to expect, and so you didn't cover that. So yeah, remember some teachers, they would stop at World War II, and I'd say, but what about Korea? We want to hear about. But yeah, it's like you promised. It's that sort of thing, that expectations that are made in these groups, and universities were supposed to enforce it. And particularly, could you imagine the possibilities of fraud? People coming along and saying, yeah, I got a lot of education. I mean, I remember when I was in school, there was actually somebody who was caught and didn't really have a PhD. I know, and you think he fooled them all. And I guess now you just go to the internet, right? But back then, I think people might have, oh yeah, I got it. I finished up, and it's amazing. And then you think back then, what must have been going on. A lot of people say, yeah, I know legal history. I've got all that. I know every pope legal. Yeah, got it all right here. Yeah. So all of that needs oversight, because we provide a lot of the funding. We love that term, funding. So we got a lot of funding from tithes and offerings. So if we're providing all this funding for these newly developed universities, we want to make sure there's some proper learning and not improper learning. Because what if I'm teaching all of it on illegal teaching? And there could be that going on, and you could be called into the bishop's office, I suppose, and so there's some students who are saying some things about you. I don't even want to repeat it. That you seem to love pagans. I don't know what your problem is, but you get the idea that if you are called to account, you could be, as we like to say in the South, a heap of trouble. Okay, because the bishops or their representatives claim oversight. I mean, you're in the cathedral, because the idea of the modern university with its own campus and dorms and all the rest, that's relatively modern, certainly not part of the Middle Ages. They simply rent space wherever for their classes. And only with the development of these universities, professors, students, and all the rest, are we getting even that idea of an institution? So to have institution physically existing will take time, to say the least. But again, here we have, unfortunately not clear, but you can see the same idea of the teacher up higher and basically reading from the Latin verb, meaning to read, reading the law code or whatever it is. I mean, I guess it could be a scientific work or something, and basically providing comments about it as he goes through. And you say, well, does he have to be witty or clever? Or no, because we're not there for wit or charm. It's like you say, so this is an endurance test. It can be, because they're not there, ratemyprofessor.com. I don't think they're running a popularity contest, right? So, but don't you worry, some got turned in for being a little pro-pagan. Yeah. I mean, maybe you said something about Cicero wasn't Christian and he was a great man. Well, then I know, we're going to the bishop's representative. Tattletale, yeah. Then there was Abelard. Peter Abelard. One of the most interesting and, dare I say, notorious of all the great intellects of this period. Virtually everyone knows about Abelard for being controversial, for being eminent, brilliant. We know a lot about him because he talked a lot about himself. He actually wrote his autobiography called The History of My Calamities, and I would say he had them, many self-induced. He was the son of a knight from Brittany, so he came from what I guess today we would call upper middle class family, but he wasn't cut out for the knighting life. But he was definitely cut out for the life of the intellect. He became a great teacher. And in addition to writing his autobiography, he wrote a work which created furor amongst the church's leaders and scholars. Yes and no. It was a work in which he would select quotations from scripture which either supported or denied some precept of the Catholic Church. And instead of saying, well, what it means is, he would say, I think we all just need to do with it what we think best. Well, that's not really what the church would like. That's not, quote unquote, acceptable. Yes and no. So you have the pro and the con. And he says, so it's up to you to use your own rationality to decide what is right. And they definitely don't care for that. That is one of his most famous writings, and you can imagine that was quite controversial. So he's not going to get Clergyman of the Year awards or anything of the sort. There were other issues too, and you see the woman here, and she became the subject. They even have the letters now, Penguin edition, Amazon available, overnight delivery. Yeah, may not be in a romance or some of that, some movie, but you can read the actual letters, and it's absolutely fascinating. I don't know. This, of course, is not reality because she was not covered like that when they knew each other. She was a young student, and apparently he tutored her. Now, this romantic depiction of what today we call sexual harassment, academic, and you say, who knows what it was really like, but this is definitely romantic.
So again, this is flight 6016 with services to Washington, Dulles. You do know that Atlanta Fashion have very tight connections. If you're not familiar with the Washington Dulles area,
Please put your mute on.
I just muted them.
I think we're in airport.
Oh, did I do?
No.
Oh, okay. So the idea being they wanted learning, but instead the book of love prevailed. And you say, but it's wrong. Yes, yes, yes. Back then, I don't know how much difference, a decade perhaps in age. Whatever the case, they were engaged in something that was inappropriate. And you notice the figure coming in. I don't think it was exactly that way, but according to his autobiography, Abelard's fate came about because Eloise's uncle was not pleased, even though after the affair and after they were married and had a child, they daringly called Astrolabe after the astronomical discovery, because I guess they thought that was a cool name. Her uncle had people emasculate him. And of course, the result was the end of the marriage. Eloise, perhaps because of Abelard, retreated to the religious life because she would have continued as his wife. But now they're not going to be married. So, yeah, that pretty much ends there. Where is Astrolabe? I don't know. I've wondered for many, many years, decades, in fact. Where did Astrolabe go? Whatever the case, Eloise made a wonderful nun. She became an abbess. I mean, she was quite a scholar, quite an administrator, and all the rest. But the letters between them always indicate, I know, a little Harlequin action. There's always that love of Babylon. And of course, he'll write back and says, those were great times, and we just need to get on with our religious responsibilities. So, yeah, he was long past it. But it's absolutely fascinating in terms of what he did. And he continued to write and to become a still controversial scholar. But that was the end of that. But a fascinating period in terms of religious history and an understanding of how significant it was in that sort of relationship between students and teachers at that particular time. Now, if you're looking for likenesses, I'm hoping that by now we are protecting people from that kind of romantic attraction between teachers and students. But all of that is to say that you can go to a graduation, whatever college or university you're talking about, and get a sense of all of the remainders from these medieval universities in terms of the dress and many of you with children have proudly witnessed their graduation and your own, and thought how this goes on regardless of how old our school is or how young it is. We understand all of these rituals have these long, long histories behind them. The idea of curricula, of degrees like a master's and a doctoral degree, and doctor, of course, has to do, with not medicine, but to do with a level beyond the master's. And all of this is to say that it comes from the medieval period. The town and gown issues that we still experience right here have to do with the fact that students were all male and they sometimes drank too much and disturbed communities and wanted to date or go out with the daughters of local people. And all of this, of course, even when all of these documents were discovered back in the early 20th century or late 19th, fascinates people to understand, or they thought, well, these issues go on. I mean, like people writing home to their parents for an advance, or parents writing and say, you need to be studying more. You ought to be going to class. You may know people like that. So you understand that these kinds of issues, not, or perhaps spending more money than you really need to be frugal. But all of this is very interesting. Oh, and their letters where they talk about spending too much time having sports and playing sports games, or all of the issues. And we think, how do they have time for that? I don't know. I would say, though, probably cutting class, wouldn't you? And again, you can imagine all those hours of class, lectures too. Okay, so you're not going like, oh, well, that was funny. Maybe I'll come back. No, I mean, it's like, this is intense. And you say, well, why are they there? Well, you think about what are your options. And so these folks were there. How many made it? And we do always understand this is a very elite activity. and very restricted, I think, to a select group. And of course, they're going to be clergy. Some of them will be very high clergy, and they will be significant. But that, of course, doesn't mean that they don't enjoy these worldly activities, even though they may love the law code and want to study it and just but they might come to class hungover. And you may have known people like that. I don't know. Yes, very sad. Of course, we've all been to these cathedrals, seen the photographs of them, and understand. This is one I saw as I went from Scotland to back to England. And this is one of the most famous examples there in Durham, way up north England, of the Romanesque style. I can't imagine, without modern engineering, to imagine how this was constructed. I mean, it's really amazing to think about. And I used to wonder also how ironic that the 16th century, it's been Church of England. Now, you think, why does that matter? Well, the Catholics built it, but it was a fellow named Henry VIII, and things changed. So it is so beautiful, though. The irony is, Durham is, or was the last time I was there, quite an industrial town. So it's not, I mean, this looks very picturesque, as in the postcards. Yeah, wish you were here, having a great time in Durham, that kind of thing. But the truth is, and even back in Thatcher's time, great poverty, great industrial, miners, all the rest. This is, of course, what makes it Romanesque, and you're going like, but what about the Virgin Mary? What about the candles? Sorry, C of E. Get over it. Yeah. But anyway, this is a beautiful place. I'm not so sure. It's more a place of activities befitting, a place that's very poor, as opposed to a great religious place. But it took religion, I would think, a great deal of faith to bring this about. They always emphasize, of course, the civic pride that must have come about to have developed all those resources to bring this about, because you have to do a lot of fundraising. And I'm sorry, donuts are not going to cut it. I mean, we're talking some serious money, the church in part, but others too. So anyway, that comes from Durham. And of course, we all know Short. And here we have the so-called Gothic style. And that always kills me. They called it Gothic because Goth was considered a bad word. You Goth. God, you're ugly. I mean, yeah, that was a hurtful thing. You just don't go around calling these buildings Gothic. And now we consider that such a nice thing to say. Oh, you're so Gothic. That's how things change. But as opposed to the Romanesque, you can see from this and Short, which I guess is the most famous of all of them, when you see it, and now that is Catholic. So today, and the sanctuary, and of course, the famous rose window, with the same issue, I dare say, with the idea of the enormity and the great windows that are absolutely splendid, which I understand were stored during during World War II, for fear that it might have been destroyed. In any event, this rose window and all of the stained glass are among the most famous and are another example, I would say, of medieval skills. And of course, I could mention Notre Dame as well. But all of this is merely to indicate another level of medieval accomplishments in the fine arts, but to understand, of course, how much of it was devoted to the purposes of the religious faith, because, everybody in town, virtually, except for, their Jewish communities, were supposed to be part of this church, one church. Now, what has always fascinated me about medieval intellectual life is that struggle to bring it all together in one banner. I mean, there is one God, and God has created one truth. And the question is, how are we going to know that one truth when we have one group saying they have it here and another group saying it comes there? People like Abelard, who might be called skeptics or just a challenger, I don't know, I'm going to say that's up to you. And of course, the church can't accept that, because we can't have everybody walking the streets and speculating. Well, what do you think? It's like, it's an interesting problem, particularly because of the nature of faith at that time. Because you say, well, aren't the Orthodox over there? Well, that's them. They're wrong anyway. And so it's like, we know what's right. It's the Catholic way. So since we're right and they're wrong, they're not part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. They're part of the problem. But we understand there is the truth that is propounded by the church. But, and you'll notice I mentioned here Aristotle. Yeah, he's coming to an area near you, coming from down south, which is very odd. You say, but they know about him. All of his works in Constantinople. Yeah, but we don't do Greek. So it looks like these works, many of which had been available, but because of this antagonism between East and West, were virtually unknown by Westerners, which is a very, very odd and sad business. But suddenly, thanks to the Muslims in Spain, Muslim scholars, they are achieving them for the West after they've gone through all these translations. It's amazing, from Greek to Arabic to Hebrew, and then finally to Latin. That's a lot of folks working. And you can't do it on the computer either. I mean, this is really, and talk about time consuming. Yeah. And yeah, no Gutenberg. So yeah, you can forget that. So I'm telling these people don't have time for extracurricular activities. Can you imagine all of the issues that are going on? You say, well, yeah, wouldn't they rather have it the original? Well, maybe so, but they can't read it. So instead, someone will come along and get these Latin versions. And of course, everybody's going to go, wow, this is so great. And I mean, they just all kind of be, the t-shirts, I love Aerosol. I mean, yeah, can you imagine? Because people are just going, hey, if you're a part of that group, I mean, if you are into crop growing or that kind of thing, I don't think you need an Aristotelian t-shirt. Okay, so this is a very, very special group. People are interested in philosophy and physics and all those fields. Here he is. Yes. We love Alexander the Great, all the rest you remember. He was called the master of those who know. Some of you will remember from your study of Dante. And remember, Dante ran into him in that special section before you go to hell. I mean, it's a nice place, and you hang out with old philosophers and scholars, and you just sigh because you can't go to heaven. But it's still not bad. I mean, you're good pagans. You're not in hell. You're near it, but you're near it. And Dante turns to Virgil, you recall, and says, but master, who is the one that everybody's kind of going around like a groupie? About people like that. We love fans. We love fans. The master of those who know. He is not named. And my professor used to say, that's because no one who read that had any doubt who it was. I'm going like, really? But that's the truth, that Aristotle was just it. You say, well, did that change? Yeah, there was a fellow named Isaac Newton, and things changed. But until then, you want to know something? Go to Aristotle. Astronomy, physics, whatever you need. We have it all here. Aristotle will answer your questions. And the fact that they now had him, all of his greatest hits, through series of translations, gave great momentum on the university level to education, especially because of the use of logic. And remember, we are not now into experimentation or anything like that, but we are into the use of logic as a method of proof. And here becomes this great disciple, Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Every student of the history of the church or the history of philosophy or sorted other history of the English monarchy, will know of Anselm, or saint as he is. Anselm did many interesting things. I will not discuss any of those, although some of you know that he gave the English kings of his day a run for their money. But in this case, we're interested as him as a scholar, using logic to prove the existence of God why there must be a God and why there was the incarnation of God the Father as the Son. Logically, he would always say, of course, I know these to be true by faith, but it is possible then to use logic to show that it's true. So, why did God become man? In other words, showing logically why the incarnation was done to save humankind. So, a quotation here, which obviously was popular with, I guess, some church or some other group. For I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe. In other words, I already believe. It's a saint, for goodness sakes. But I believe in order to understand. In other words, you start with the faith, and then you can, shall we say, supplement it with the rational evidence of the truth. So that's one approach, but it is logical in his way of thinking. Now, how would St. Anselm feel about Peter Abelard? Not good. Okay. That would not be warm and fuzzy. Okay. Because Abelard was too skeptical. Abelard was saying that these points of view and you do what you think is right. But St. Anselm says there's a right. And reason is very good. Because but by the time Anselm, it's a little pre the full corpus of Aristotle's works. But there's enough known to understand the importance of logic and how significant that is in fully understanding, because the idea is logic, according to the scholars of that day, would make possible certainty in terms of knowledge. Can you imagine that? We can't imagine it nowadays, but that certainty they had with that understanding of the significance of logic. Because, of course, experimentation is long in the future at that time. Now, Abelard, go on down past the Latin, unless you're a purist, and I respect that. By doubting, we come to inquiry, and through inquiry, we perceive truth.
Go ahead.
That's a very, very different perspective from that of Abelard, is it not? Of St. Anselm, rather. So I just bring that to your attention and to understand that each point of view and others besides will be part of the university community. And I'm thinking, you put it in modern terms, I guess, everybody's gathering around for coffee and chat, not the worldly stuff, not going to some rock and roll dive. I mean, to talk about logic. And you say, yikes. Well, that's what you're there for. You're for learning and debating and all the rest of it. So you're Abelards, in other words, you're serious crowds, relatively serious. Obviously, Abelard had his fun, but let's say that he was a great scholar, and we understand that this will be part of what he does. Though I am sure, as far as I'm aware, that he was a devout, I mean, he was a very believing Christian. Even though some of his fellow churchmen had some issues with the way he approached it. But you understand the difference between Anselm and Abelard and how they couldn't get close because their points of view were very different. The idea of scholasticism, from schola meaning school, has to do with how people are going to react to Aristotle and other scholars. And you say, but, oh, you might have people say that, how is this going to help me get a job? Or how? They knew they were going to do that. They were all going to be scholars, and so it was very easy. It was just a matter of which particular institution you were going to, if you were going to follow that life. As far as scholasticism, studying reason and revelation, and believe you me, I'm sure there was quite enough to keep you busy, and you could go through a whole pot of coffee arguing and carrying on about all of this. If you've ever taken philosophy, I rest my case. It's not something, just the facts here. Yeah, no. Talk. Jesuits, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's no Jesuit, though. He's known as Averroes. Averroes was an Islamic scholar in Spain who was known as Averroes in the West and became, I would say, sensational among a certain populace because he was the great conduit of Aristotle. He must have known many languages, so what we would call a polyglot. I love that word.
I like polymath too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I cannot imagine all that Averroes knew. And of course, he knew all about the great works of Islam, the great works of Christianity, Judaism, and more to our point, all the works of Greece and Rome. So he's got a lot going on. And he became very, very important because it will be through the translations and explanations provided by Averroes. You say, but what of the Crusades? More of that later. But for right now, I'm just trying to tantalize you. We understand among scholars, there was a sense, well, Averroes is going to hell. But since he did these versions of Aristotle, we can use it. He's still burning. But all of that is very interesting to know how significant Averroes is, since it will be through his versions that we will know him. Not that he is completely acceptable even in Islamic Spain, and certainly not in medieval France. He will be considered, quote unquote, controversial because of his views, which will be a kind of threat to the establishment of both Muslims and Christians. They have that in common. Averroes and his followers and those in Western Europe call Latin Averroes, if you ever see that term. I don't even know if modern scholars use it, but they certainly used to. And that is someone, maybe you're in Paris maybe you're one of the big shot professors. And you have an interpretive work of Aristotle's greatest hits as provided by Averroes. And you start telling your students, well, you know, class, I love our church. I love it so much. So, and I'm, oh, that Pope, he's a great, great leader. And that's one truth. But you know what? There's another truth that we know through philosophy. I think we're getting into some trouble with a capital T, because that is the idea of Latin Averroism. You have the truth by faith, and you have the truth by reason. Each day's faith, reasons. Don't mix them up. That's Latin Averroism. That is Averroism coming on. And how did Averroes do back home? Not well. Yeah. He got a no-no from the Islamic authorities. Yeah. I'd imagine he had his Muslim in good standing card removed, because, I mean, the idea of having two truths. I can't imagine there are many religions that say, well, whatever you're comfortable with, we're comfortable with you. I don't think so. This isn't the Enlightenment, folks. There's one truth. So Latin Averroism, we understand, will be very controversial, and it certainly was in Spain, and it certainly will be in France. Perhaps the more liberal environment of universities would allow some of that to go on. But you understand that the church's authority and the administration of the officials will mean that those who teach it, or certainly who teach it, is, well, this is just up to you, whatever you want to think. But that's, some great scholars. That's what they're saying. So I hope you young people, you're comfortable with it. I think we got some problems, and you might lose your job. No tenure for you. Yeah, you're going down. And that brings up the great one that Frank mentioned earlier. I just can't get enough of him, Thomas Aquinas. One of the most prolific scholars that I've ever heard of. I remember where I went to college, there was a philosophy professor. He had a year-long course called The Thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. If you're wondering if I took it as an elective, wrong. I thought, as much as I admired the teachings of St. Thomas, it's kind of like many delicacies. A little bit goes a long way. Because this is deep, folks. Deep, deep, deep. A lot of coffee there. He was called the divine ox because he was a big man. He lived to age of 49, and here we may have the illustration of, in his later life, before his death, he renounced all that he had done and became a mystic. So I'm beginning to think there are two versions of this. One version is that his family had brought in a young woman to tempt him, and he drove her out with a torch. The other, of course, shows him burning all of his writings. to become a mystic. So I guess he was in his late 40s before his death. And which seems very interesting, the idea of none of this really matters. All that matters is being with God. So the idea is he was a very interesting person and almost legendary during his own lifetime. He would, according to one story, dine with the King of France, and the French suddenly, in the middle of the meal, Aquinas was beating his head down, saying something like, "This will show the heretics they're wrong." And it was like, when you're supposed to be paying attention, the king's there. Kings were important back then, whatever we may think of them. This is Louis IX. I'm sure you would like to get to eat with him. But Aquinas he's brilliant. People like that. And so instead of being mad, according to the story, this comes out of the life of St. Louis. St. Louis had a scribe come to write down what was coming out of Aquinas' mind. I know it's good to be brilliant. But according to these stories, he just never knew when something would come out. So I always think he's probably not teaching intro to philosophy at the university. I'm thinking this guy was probably busy coming out with all kinds of ideas. And you remember, and I can't guarantee this is available on Amazon, the Summa Theologica, which would combine the teachings of Catholic Church with Aristotelianism. And again, you are not to sit in a comfortable chair, and you are to drink a stimulant before you start, because we don't want to go into slumber during the reading of Summa Theologica. But it is deep. It's some really deep stuff. I've done some sort of like excerpts, we'll put it that way. And I got satisfied. I got all I needed. But that's to say, maybe that's just my limit. Anyway, the angels loved him. And believe you me, he makes Dante's Paradiso. And yeah, exactly. And you think, wow, Dante wasn't that long after St. Thomas. He wasn't, but I mean, Aquinas hit the big time very early. And what had he done? Well, I'll tell you exactly what he did. Oh, here he is. He was probably in his 40s by now. And the idea is, of course, down with Latin Averroism. He is a saint. And the reason he is a saint is because he showed logically that there could be no space between God's teachings in Scripture and the teachings of nature, as shown by the master of those who know. Aristotle and God have to be together. And when Aristotle seems to be in conflict with that, well, then he's wrong. And this will be carefully worked out. I promise you that. But as far as I'm aware, I mean, he uses arguments from Aristotle for the existence of God, like first mover and all that you probably studied in school. And he will take these over and say, these are just more proofs. But again, whenever Aristotle's teachings are not in keeping with what the church teaches, then he's wrong. Yeah, because the church is right. All of this is to say that he seems to have it all together. And of course, later, much later, he will be considered the ultimate interpreter of Catholic philosophy. But even in the years after him, after his death, in the 14th century, and I'm thinking of specific philosophers, will actually dare criticize him and say that's not the way it works and he was wrong. And they were not particularly well regarded by church authorities because once this whole idea of Thomas Aquinas, what we call Thomism, the teachings of Aquinas, that's going to be it. And that didn't happen, as far as I'm aware, for a very ways down south. But it worked out here up to a point in keeping that opinion. Now, do we still have underground philosophy groups who are saying, I don't agree with Aquinas? I'm sure they did. I mean, you know how it is in the university. It's not just people, do we have to know that? I mean, you know, there are some people who are really, really interested, shocking, but true. And they want to debate Aquinas or debate all of these ideas. That's the nature of the university. So that would go on, but as far as the church is concerned, we've got it together. Thomas Aquinas is the man. One thing, of course, Thomas Aquinas thought, as did many others, something needs to be done about those people in the Holy Land. Yes, exactly. So that means segue to Crusades coming to a classroom near you next week. Thank you all very much.
I said apple art doesn't make Saint good.